Yeah, you use the mic to speak.
All right, I think we'll make a start. Well, good afternoon to everybody here in the room. We have a great audience going on in person, but I know that there's a huge number of people also online as well. So welcome again to this event, Revisiting the UN Water Conference, 46 Years of Learning and Forgetting. My name is Naho Miramachi. I'm a professor of environmental politics at King's College London, and I'm also the co-director of the King's Water Centre, which is an interdisciplinary research centre that tackles all sorts of things around water and water sustainability. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to finally see my colleagues in person. I can almost touch them. They're sitting next to me side by side, and there are your wonderful hosts, your co-hosts for this event today. Let me explain a little bit of the structure that we have going on for the next hour and a half, and then I'll introduce both Alan and Lila, and then we'll get to the speakers. So we have a really interesting set of ideas and debates going on today, and this is really pitched around the idea of what have we learned over almost half a century of various water conference meetings, various agendas, and where are we going to in the future? This month, I find this event very timely because it's just a few days in advance of the World Water Day 2023. This year, the theme is accelerating change for access to water and wash issues. Next week, there is a major conference going on in New York. Both Lila and Alan are going. I'm not, so as a commiseration prize, I think I get to host this event. But that UN Water Conference is a pretty major one, and they intend to set out this water action agenda, which I'm sure some of our speakers and some of the discussion will touch upon. So it's really to critically probe and think about the policy directions, the trends, some of the things that have been achieved, and where some of the gaps and missed opportunities are. We intend this to be a very lively interaction with you in person and also online. So if you are online, please do continue to post your questions, comments on the chat box, and we'll be monitoring it throughout. And then for those of you in the room, please do ask your questions when we open it up, when we open up the floor. And importantly, I've been told to remind you that there is wine and nibbles afterwards. So you must stay onwards, and so that we can continue the conversation. I think I've spoken already enough, so let me move on into talking a little bit about the background, which Alan will let us know a little bit about. So Alan, here on my left, is the Director of Water Growth and Inclusion at the International Water Management Institute. Prior to joining IMI, he directed the Global Water Initiative East Africa for CARE International, and he had a career in research think tanks on water and development, and I think he's a very familiar face here at IDS. He's a political scientist by training and currently co-leads the National Policies and Strategies for Food, Land and Water Systems Transformation Initiative of the CGIAR. Lila, here on my right-hand side, is a professor at the Institute of Development Studies and also visiting professor at Norge, the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Lila uses the case of water and sanitation to focus on the politics of scarcity, gender, human rights and access to resources, resource grabbing, power and policy processes in rural, peri-urban and urban contexts. Her work also focuses on climate change, uncertainty and transformation and forced displacement. She has extensive research and field experience in India and Southern Africa, and she's been studying and engaging in a range of global water processes and debates for over 2 decades. Her most recent book, Water, Food Security, Nutrition and Social Justice, is out, and The Politics of Climate Change and Uncertainty in India is available. And I think she's also got some copies of some of her books for those of you in the room. So you're more than welcome to take a look, even take a copy, I believe. but they're available for you. So my two hosts here, I'm going to hand the floor over to Alan to give us a little bit of some background. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Naho. Right, yeah, thank you. Brilliant. Thank you, Naho, for that very generous introduction. Am I unmuted? Yeah. So both Lana and myself have been following kind of global processes in the water sector for a few decades, Lana. And we felt that this is an event that needs a little bit of scrutiny and examination because, you know, it's a global event. It's an international conference. It's almost a once in a career or once in a lifetime event. It's been 46 years since the first UN Water Conference, the only one to date. So we convened this event to look a little bit more in depth at what was the significance of the UN conference and why is it important that we take a critical lens to the New York conference that's taking place next week. That photo is the opening panel for Mar-del Plata in 1977, and two key figures in the middle of that photo are Dr. Yahya Abdul-Majid on the left, who was the Sudanese Minister for Water and Irrigation at the time, who was brought in, interestingly, quite late in the process, because the process wasn't going very well, to organize the conference back in 1977. He was brought in 1976. And on his left, on the right of the picture, is Mustafa Tolba, who was the head of the United Nations Environment Programme at the time. So, you know, two key figures who led this conference. Interestingly, two key figures from a very important river basin, who led the output, led the process, and delivered what was a groundbreaking conference at that time. A very important event for many reasons, and we'll delve into some of that during this meeting. But I want to set a little bit of context to the 1977 conference. The late 70s, you're all students of development studies. I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but you know, it was a huge time in global processes. It was a tipping point, to use that term. It was a period of enormous transition, almost from one world to another world. There was some huge politics swirling around by the late 70s. The oil crisis in 1973-74 had precipitated in massive inflationary pressures in the Western world, in Western economies, in the industrialized world, leading to what would eventually become a banking crisis. And Latin America led that crisis, unfortunately, due to the lending processes of banks combined with the increase in interest rates that was precipitated by the sudden quadrupling in the price of oil around the Yom Kippur War in 1973-74. So it was a period of huge turmoil economically, precipitating something that could perhaps be called the first development crisis. It was a time when government was under scrutiny, when there was a sense of pressure against the role of the state. From the late 70s to the early 80s, a transition taking place in some of the ideologies surrounding policy on development, surrounding the role of government, and a shrinkage in the public sector because of the debt crisis. So it precipitated at that late 70s period a real change in ideologies of development. And some of those processes caught the tail end of the Mar-del Plata conference. So the Mar-del Plata conference was on the back of a process of UN conferencing, with Stockholm in 1972, with the population conference, a range of conferences, and then you had this economic impact. And the geopolitics in the late 70s was almost the peak of the Cold War. So some of the proxy wars, some of the issues in Africa, some of the satellite states, some of the challenges globally around that geopolitics involved the end of, towards the end, certainly, of the Cold War. And on the right-hand side, a process of thinking about resources that was triggered partly in the late 60s and the early 70s around examining the nature of resources, the Malthusianisms that came through, the scarcity narratives, the water crisis narratives that were part of that process were really embedded in some of the Mar-del Plata thinking, and certainly in the output of the conference in 1977. It was also a period of enormous greening of politics, the emergence of green politics in Europe, for example, the Green parties in Germany, the greening of humanitarianism, the aid and development processes that took place in the early 70s, the mid 70s, triggered partly by responses to things like the Ethiopia drought in 73, 74, reinforced by some of those experiences in the mid 80s of, again, you know, these seminal or periodic droughts that affected the perception of water availability, that reinforced ideas of scarcity. So out of this process, the late 70s was a turning point in some ways in development, and coincidentally, perhaps a poor coincidence of events, but the output of Mar-del Plata came around that time in the late 70s when there were these massive transitions taking place. So in the Limits to Growth report, that's controversial in some ways, that was very much about tipping points and the idea that by 2000, by the 21st century, resources would become scarce, food availability per capita would decline, industrial output would decline. These dramatic curves were part of the narrative in that period, in the late 70s, around the idea of sudden scarcity, of decline in availability of food, and a sense that all of these challenges, including water and the water-food relationship, needed to be dealt with. So the Mar-del Plata conference was part of that process of thinking through and trying to deal with these incredibly complex challenges. The Limits to Growth report that came out of the Club of Rome, of course, in the early 70s, had been the first examination of some of these relationships by computer modeling. So interestingly, that was one of those periods, those shifts taking place where computer modeling was bringing these kinds of graphs to light using data sources that some have criticized, but nevertheless were believed to be perhaps more justified because they came out of a new way of understanding relationships between resources, population growth, pollution, and industrialization. So the agenda that came out of Mar-del Plata in 1977 in the action plan, a 50-page document, it's online, you can read it, it's hard going, it's incredibly detailed, it covers almost everything under the sun, it's a wish list, effectively. But it went through water resources assessment, efficiency, health and pollution control, policy planning and management, natural hazards, public information and education, regional cooperation, international cooperation. It really did try and touch on everything. It's a fascinating read. If you are a student of environment or water, it's really important to look at it. It also had annexes that talked about resource access in the occupied territories. It had, if you look at the text and some of those areas I've highlighted on the right, it had some very political statements about water, about access to water, about justice and rights. It was quite a political text. So it's worth looking at it in the context of the late 70s. The PLO, for example, was a participant in the conference. You know, there were some very important political elements to the process that perhaps get forgotten in the mists of history, that we need to look back on and understand a little bit more and interpret in terms of maybe some of the challenges in going forward and taking this agenda forward. But the progress of that Mar-del Plata action plan, I would argue, and I think, you know, this is definitely worthy of a PhD or two, but there was an ideological standoff that kicked off in the 1980s, partly because of the debt crisis, but also partly because of the shifts in political stances by governments. You had Reaganism, you had Thatcherism, you had a lot of new shrinkage of the state narratives. You had this diminished multilateralism emerging over the 1990s. You could argue some of that again started in the early conflicts in the Gulf region in 1990, the invasion of Iraq. You know, lots of the processes that happened, some of the political processes were really chipping away at the multilateralism of that time. So I would argue diminished multilateralism made perhaps having a follow-up conference 20 years later harder, but also the development context became came or emerged or evolved in a new way. You had new actors. The Chinese role in development started to emerge in the 1990s. You had this complex actor landscape that wasn't there in the late 70s, that emerged during the 80s and started cementing in during the 1990s. And many power perceptions and political tectonics started shifting. And perhaps most important is that climate change from the mid-1990s onwards became one of those signal elements in development discourse with the establishment of the UNFCCC in the mid-1990s. The biosphere changes, the hydrological shifts, the biodiversity loss, major new concerns shifted away from understanding water and land and food as simple discrete elements to this much bigger picture shift around the notion of climate change being a new major development challenge. Did it overshadow Mar-del Plata? I don't know, but it certainly became an incredibly important global focus. And one of the reasons for that is simply put in these graphs. If you look at the blue arrow, that is Mar-del Plata, when atmospheric carbon dioxide was just over 320 parts per million. It is now over 400 parts per million. So in the space of the 46 years since Mar-del Plata, there has been a 30% increase in atmospheric CO2. So in terms of a category difference between that late 70s period and our understanding of where we are now, there have been these enormous increases, shifting, for example, the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere by 2% per decade. So now we're in a situation where we have a new UN conference coming up with a very, very different set of challenges. Arguably, the biggest challenge of all is climate change, and the narratives around climate change will probably be very important in New York. However, it's a 3-day conference. It's a conference maybe without a very strong agenda, without a very strong political output associated with it. So there are questions around how far it's gone and how well it's responding to this category shift in the global hydrosphere, the global biosphere. And we need to think carefully and critically about whether or not there's enough being done to consider how to manage globally water systems in future, how to understand the transformations that need to take place. And a shameful plug here of some of Imi's work recently on looking at some of these transformations. There's a link there to follow. Transformative futures for water security. What does a water secure future look like? So thinking through that is one of those things we've been doing recently. And we argue the UN conference is an essential step in that process, but does it go far enough? And Lila and myself have been thinking about some of this, thinking about some of the narratives that came out of Mar-del Plata, and considering some of the risks involved now in the new climate environment. How far do we need to take a new narrative, perhaps a more social narrative on collective action, in which we build water and climate resilience through collective responses from the local level up to the global level, and avoiding some of the narratives of the past that have taken us more towards the role of markets, the role of the private sector, and the role of individuals. So towards a new social narrative is where we're starting to think maybe some of the policy and the output of New York needs to go, because it's clearly a more collective issue and a more collective response that's required now, given the scope and the challenges facing the global water community. So those are my opening remarks, and I want to hand back to you now. Thank you very much now.
Okay, thank you so much, Alan, for that brilliant background and already some provocative ideas around where this new narrative should be. So now the camera is going to shift on to our two online speakers. I'm thrilled that we have the brilliant Francois Moll and Guri Ghosh joining with us, joining from all sorts of places, from France and India, despite the time differences. Both of our speakers online online will give a 10-minute talk to add a little bit more meat to these ideas around the political economy, thinking around the UN processes, and then we'll then come back, the camera will shift back into this room, and Lila will give us some thoughts about looking forward about the expectations from the New York conference next week. So I believe our two speakers are online. I think you can see them on screen. Yes. So I'll first introduce Francois Moll, who will speak for 10 minutes, and then the screen will turn over to Guri, who will speak for 10 minutes. So let me introduce you, Francois. He is a senior researcher at the Institut de Recherche pour le Développement, IRD in France. He has 35 years of experience in water management, water governance, and water policies, especially in Brazil, the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Southeast Asia, and he is the co-editor of Water Alternatives. I know there are a lot of students in the room and potentially online. If you don't know the journal Water Alternatives, please go and Google it. It's a fantastic source. And Francois and his team has been doing a brilliant job gathering some very critical, very innovative papers in this journal series. Francois will talk a bit about the wider political economy and political policy context of the global events and their significance. So I'll hand over the floor to you, Francois.
Thank you very much now for this introduction, and thanks to the organizers for their invitation, but also for the initiative to discuss this forthcoming meeting. Let me start echoing Alan with a small interrogation about what this UN conference is meant to achieve, actually. The initial objectives of the proposed meeting was to carry out a midterm review of the implementation of the International Decade Water for Sustainable Development. So it was planned for 3 days, not for 1 or 2 weeks, as you would expect. For some odd reason, or to me, it's convened not by the UN, but by the Netherlands and Tajikistan. And although I understood the Water Action Agenda is expected to gather the voluntary commitments of organizations and governments, it's still unclear to me what are the expected outcomes. So maybe something we can discuss later. So, however, I would say global conferences rarely innovate or discover something that nobody had thought about before, which makes somewhat conspicuous the language of game changers, transformative or disruptive innovation, paradigm shifts that is used in the communication of the conference. Global conferences, I think, on the one hand, are part of the social life of the water sector writ large, which we all belong to. So they afford opportunities for exchange, networking, flag waving, but their impact seems to me to be to emphasize, validate, legitimize, some would say make hegemonic specific concepts or principles. I think we can think of IWRM, of course, and the way the economic dimension of water was foregrounded through the fourth Dublin Principle. We can think of water security or the right to water as emerging concepts partly from this big conference. But have these concepts changed the water world? We certainly learn to foreground new issues with time and with concepts like ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, water footprint, water stewardship, environmental justice, hydrohegemony, the right to water, the rights of rivers, and so on and so on. So this semantic creativity, I think, cannot be downplayed, since it does contribute to shaping the world of ideas, and therefore has a bearing on what people think and do. Yet, what one could also wonder to what extent practice and actual governance have changed, and how the conference will address this side of the problem. So the element we can look at to answer that question, because of course we are speaking before the conference itself, but we can look at the 5 1.5-hour sessions that occurred in New York in October, and also the 5, I would say, quite uninspiring and anonymous concept notes that are published on the UN website prior to the conference. So the concept notes use the so-called accelerators of the SDG acceleration framework to scan these several thematics. They use financing, data and information, capacity development, innovation, and governance. No one will deny that data, financing, capacity building are important, if not crucial aspects of the problem. But I'm worried to see the all too common suggestion that more of them is always and necessarily better, and that we merely need to accelerate. Give you some example. I'm worried to see in concept note number 2, questions formulated as how do we build the global water project pipeline quickly? Or that a financial gap in the water sector estimated between 200 and 600 billion US dollar annually needs to be bridged quickly. I'm worried about investments in data collection when I see donor-funded telemetering systems laying waste across the world. I might be worried also about investment in wastewater treatment when I see some countries with more than half of the stations out of work. So again, all these things are obviously very much needed, but did we do the qualitative, institutional, political analysis that would allow us to understand this situation and to make sure that these needed investments are not useless or wasteful? I think we seem not to be learning from the implementation quagmires that we see around us. We demand from governments things that they are not able or unwilling often to deliver. We continue to design investments and reforms in a world with no contingency, as if there were no contingency, and to measure success through the amount of money spent often. So telling you, if you look at the concept notes, there are litanies of should, must, need to, which basically hammer and reiterate that everything wrong needs to be righted. Let me give you some example of the sentence. We have water infrastructure development projects are notorious for a cycle of build, neglect, rebuild. There's a need to break this wasteful and disempowering cycle. Other quote, to properly value water, clear, honest, and reliable data is needed, which the sector is often lacking. / strong water rights regimes, inclusive social support programs and enforcement mechanisms need to be in place to support water pricing, etc., etc. So problems are identified, incantations to get rid of what doesn't work abound, but not much is offered about the whys and the hows to overcome them. Interestingly, in one of the conference in October, Henk Ovink, the special envoy of the Netherlands to the conference, stressed the following. He said, we have to stop the things that don't work, and this will hurt as we overcome this and the way we are glued to the past. So my question is, will participants explore why we keep on doing things which don't work, despite the continued injection of some newspeak? There is little observable coming to grips with the multi-level politics of water governance. But of course, there's the ubiquitous mantra that the current water crisis is a crisis of governance. So how do the concept notes handle the governance conundrum? The elements that are stressed in the notes include the predictable and enabling environment and several other quotes, well-designed economic and environmental regulation. IWRM is the key to successful governance, multi-level governance, strengthen IWRM and promote governance at scale, promote nature-based solution. Good governance requires leadership, clear political setting, robust regulation, transparency, and coordination, etc., etc. So it is hard, I think, to see game changers in what is proposed under the heading of government. Very little is offered to address the pedestrian yet crucial issues of overexploitation of water, contamination, river basin overbuilding, groundwater depletion, inequity and exclusion, responding to climate change and resource variability without desiccating nature in the name of efficiency. As in all global conferences, we can expect a degree of self-promotion and self-congratulation, but also good ideas and cross-fertilization. Yet by nature, and I think especially because we are in a UN context, it's likely that the local, national, and international water politics will remain largely absent from the discussion. So it was interesting to see Alan stressing that there was quite a politicized statements after Mar-del Plata. So I wonder if it's not the case, if it's not happening again, what has changed that maybe has kind of sanitized the discussion about water and remaining in a large extent the politics. So I will end here with the hope, however, not to be the killjoy of this meeting.
Well, thank you very much. Certainly not a killjoy and definitely on time. So this is wonderful. Thank you so much, Francois. Now we'll move on to Guri Ghosh. I think he's on the screen. Yes, he is. Guri has an extensive career. I'm not sure if I can do justice to all the work he's done, but I'll give it a try. Since his retirement from the United Nations in 2006, he's been doing a lot of work afterwards, but also before that, before his retirement, he was the Executive Director of Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council, WSSCC. It was then that he launched the Global Wash campaign in the year 2000, resulting ultimately in the recognition of sanitation goals as one of the UN Millennium Goals in the World Summit for Sustainable Development. So he's definitely been where history has been made. He's also been working as a member of the Subcommittee on Water Sanitation of the UN MDG Task Force in the past. He was also the chair of UN Water. He was the chief of Water, Environment and Sanitation at UNICEF in New York for over a decade, when he published the first ever global strategy for water and sanitation in 1995. He's led many UN missions and helped South Africa, Malawi, Myanmar, and other countries to develop their strategy and policies in water and sanitation. With this concept and encouragement, the African Sanitation Conference, AfricaSan, and South Asian Sanitation Conference, SACOSAN, started. Thanks to his efforts. Mr. Ghosh is a geologist and economist by training. He's a former member of the Indian Administrative Service of Gujarat Cadre. He headed the Gujarat Mineral Development Corporation, Gujarat Dairy Development Corporation, and was the director of geology and mining. He's been a member of various events and companies, the CEO of the Bengal Immunity Limited, a private pharmaceutical company under the management of Government of India. He's been on water and supply and drinking water supply boards. And so he's got an extensive experience. So he's very well placed to give us an idea about the UN processes subsequent to Mar-del Plata, the UN Water Decade, its aftermath, the New Delhi Statement, and understanding the 1990s. Before we move on to Guri, was there anything that you wanted to say? You're good. No. Okay. All right. So the floor is your, Guri. You have 10 minutes. Over to you.
Yeah. Now, can you hear me? I've unmuted myself. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Whatever you said about me, it just can be summed up in one line. That is, jack of all trades and good for nothing. And with all the experiences and attending, as I heard the previous speakers about the international conference, it reminded me of two things. One is that we had a closed conference in Bangkok long back, held by Ashit Biswas, about the necessity of the large conferences. I think it was held sometimes in 2004. And the conclusion was that really these global conferences, they don't contribute anything ultimately, either in policy development or in actual implementations in the field. Rather, the recommendation was more on regional and local discussions and local integrations. And then after that, just to bring them up for detailed analysis upfront. Otherwise, these 3 days or 4 days conferences, really we found, as even my experience goes, it ends into a kind of a statement, it's into a kind of a drafting, which ultimately goes nothing. But if you look at it, some of the conferences which have been mentioned, especially which Alan explained to Mar-del Plata, which reminded me of those enthusiasms which was in the 80s, in the International Water Decade. There was some contribution of definitive contribution of Mar-del Plata and subsequently of the Millennium Goal. Now, Mar-del Plata, I totally agree with his analysis. It was a lot details, and as a result, I hardly found a person who has detailed studied the Mar-del Plata, the action, and as well as the original the recommendations. But the International Water Decade which came, for the first 4 or 5 years, the international organizations even didn't know how to proceed with it. Till around mid-80s, they focused through the Water Sanitation Program group of the World Bank and UNICEF and WHO, that especially focusing on the rural area, not much focus on the urban area at the time, that how to reach the large populations in a shorter times. And fortunately or unfortunately, I was dragged from my industrial sector experience to water at the time to manage the water program in India, which we chalked out an approach where you can easily reach people. It is a top-down approach, no doubt about it. It was a centralized government design approach without people's participation, excepting at the local level where occasionally the NGOs were involved. But basically, the whole concept was that you have to bring water to a large number of population, maybe a smaller quantity, but raise the health awareness and actually change this basic impact on hygiene also. Now, at the end of the water decade, before the Delhi conference took place, Delhi consultation took place held by UNDP. I mean, at least in India, we were able to reach to nearly 165,000 villages, which was almost nearly 3.3 crore of people. 3.3 crore is about 0.3 billion. And in the discussion which took place, consultations in the Delhi in September 1990, one of the slogan which was coined, and which was that some for all rather than more for some, rather than all for some. Now, whole concept is equitable distribution of water, whether it is drinking water, or it is an agricultural water, or it is for the water use management in a basin, river basin. Now, there was a lull after 1990, and people didn't know what to do because obviously, globally, the the conference was, the whole decade was not very successful, but we learned a lot of lessons. A lot of, the attempts have been made to bring in the new issues, which was not there earlier in the hardcore engineering solutions, gender issues, the issues related to this women involvement, especially maintaining of the hand pumps. There were issues where the local manufacturing capacity building was there. And subsequently, what happened beyond 1990, there was an attempt. First of all, there was a resolution in Delhi of setting up a platform which can bring not only the UN organization, but also the governments, NGOs, private sector, all in one platform for water sanitation. That's why the Water Sanitation Collaborative Council was formed. And it was endorsed by UN General Assembly in December 1990. Both the outcome of the Delhi Declaration, that is some for all rather than all for some, as well as the Collaborative Council. Now, at the same time, we started thinking that how to bring the holistic water management, because one of the major lessons learned during the drinking water management supply program was that the instability and uncertainty of the sources. Most of the cases, sources even developed, they dried up both hydrologically as well as, not proper management of the source water there. So what we thought that there has to be a global water partnerships with the World Bank. And then we had a lot of discussion. It was housed by World Bank. Always it was supported. Most of these initiatives, whether it is a water sanitation program or global water partnerships, they're all supported by a lot of bilaterals. And here the Sweden actually came forward to host the secretariat in Stockholm, and the global water partnership came up. Now, most unfortunate lessons which I personally have learned, that these two streams, that is the water management issues and drinking water and sanitation issues, which are more focusing on social and political causes, these two never possibly came and worked close together. And this was very unfortunate. In spite of my effort, we could not bring them together, because this one side felt that, no, if we move to the other side, it will be more politicized. And the politicized group says that we should not go to the other side, it's a more engineering or technical side. And that is a very wrong, weak point. And as a result, even today, whenever you go for any kind of a water source development, they are not sustainable. Ultimately in the long run, it actually faces a lot of problems in the management. And beyond GWP and WSSCC, what we found in 2000, then the focus shifted heavily towards sanitation. So far the water sanitation sector is concerned, because sanitation was always neglected. Even in the UN Millennium Goal of 2000, where water was a definite goal, sanitation was not a goal. And that is why I was really given the task. In fact, I still remember, indeed, then the British minister Claire Short, she almost gave a challenge to me to bring the sanitation goal in WSSD Johannesburg, which was to be held in 2002. And he said that now make it a real goal. And I must say that Claire's challenge gave me the initiative. And we, after a lot of brainstorming, we launched WASH. Now, there was a lot of debate at the time, and I'm glad that I stood on my point on that, because people said that WASH has to be exclusively for certain UN agencies and for WSSCC. I said, no, the WASH has to be popularized. It has to be brought to all over, to cutting across, whether it is a private sector, whether it is a NGO, whether it is a government, everybody can use the terminology. And secondly, I also tried to preach, but here I am absolutely a failure, that to bring the basic total river basin management concept and the supply and demand models for determining the distribution of water for the drinking water as well as for the industries and agriculture sector. And if you see the politics of water, and especially in countries, big countries like India and others, basically the water scarcity and the sources problems are created by the big agriculturists and the big industrialists who hardly pays any tax for the water and who gobbles up the whole bulk supplies there. So one of the defects we learned that it is basically lessons learned. It is a lack of an integrated approach, which creates problem in every sector, and overemphasis on the hardware, not so much on the software. Overemphasis on top-down government-driven programs, not very much on the people's participatory or decentralization program. Then you also you think of changing the the programs without consulting with the people. That means selection of the hardwares or selection of the models or designing a program without consulting the people who ultimately will be the manager, and everybody working in a silos, in isolation. Even today, the sanitation people, they work in isolation from the health. The health people do not go to the water, although the survey has shown very clearly the success of even distribution of normal water and sanitation has improved the condition of the health and reduced the child mortality. Even then, they don't go hand by hand. And last but not the least, which I'll conclude by saying, this is my lessons learned, that we always talk, and we means I define it is the water experts or sanitation experts. We talk among ourselves and we preach to the already preached. Now, who are the decision makers? The decision makers are the finance people, the big private corporate sector, the governments, which is the policy makers. And now, unless and until we really go to their level and try to sell our model, this issue of governance can never be solved. And governance is the fundamental of any water management. And this cannot be solved because you can convince 200 people in New York or anywhere where the water meeting takes place, out of which hardly 2 really have the influence on their own government or in their own countries there. That is a fact and hard fact. And unless and until we go to a semi-politicized level, unless and until we sell to them that what model they should work it out and convince them, this can never be sustainable. This is the lessons we found everywhere. And that is why just by coining slogan, I found that you could not convince people there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that brilliant overview once again. We're going to move swiftly over to Laila. I know there was a hand in the chat, but I wonder if we could hold that hand for a minute. And I know there's been lots of comments running into the chat, but let's hold that for the minute, and we'll let Laila talk a bit about the upcoming expectations, and then we'll open it to the floor. So Laila, a 10-minute or perhaps even an 8-minute from you.
All right, well then tell me how much time I have. It's so good to be here. It's lovely to have another water and sanitation event in this room. It's been a few years, and I'm so happy to be with friends from this sector, with Naho and Alan, and also so many amazing people online, and of course all of you here in the audience. So thank you very much. As Alan said, we've been both following a lot of these processes for a while. I was a child in the 70s, in that meeting. I don't remember much from then, but I certainly remember very clearly what's been happening since the mid to late 90s. So I'm going to talk to you a little about that journey. Alan has beautifully given a bit of the background of Mar-del Plata, but what really has changed in the last 46 years? So, of course, we're in a very different world. He's given a bit of the global architecture. We're talking about a world where we're going to peak at 8 to 9 billion. I mean, it was very, very different then. Poverty has gone down, but inequality has drastically increased. The Mar-del Plata world largely focused on rural issues. We're in an urbanizing world. The project that some of us are involved in here, the Brown Gold project, is very much looking at rapidly urbanizing challenges. issues of sanitation, of wastewater. These are issues that were really not there. And so many people remain off the grid and will remain off the grid for a long, long time, simply because the top-down centralized bacteriological model that we've had in the global north it just doesn't work. There's very little talk about, as we've already heard from Gauri, sanitation was not really on the agenda. Sanitation is not neglected, but it's not integrated. And we see that in these documents too, on the water action plan. So we're really talking about a lack of integration between water, waste, and sanitation. And as Alan has pointed out, we have climate change, we have climate disruption, and water is at the heart of the extreme events. If you look at floods, drought, so the uncertainty, the rhythms of water, dealing with the volatility is really something that we have to reckon with today. And that's why it's really surprising that we don't have a big global water entity like UNFCCC that meets every year. We just don't have that in the water sector. Finally, another thing that has changed is that we have water crisis, not just in the poor countries, but even in the global north. So you have the Flint crisis in North America. You have indigenous people in different parts of the global north that are excluded from water and sanitation. We're faced with a very unequal world. So I think the peculiarities of global water governance, as I said, there's no key driver or player in the UN system. UN Water coordinates UN work on water and sanitation, but it doesn't have that high profile. You have UNICEF that looks at children, you have UNDP that does reports, but basically you don't have that key driver, unlike the COPs, unlike the World Committee for Food Security, the HLP, and in fact, some of the best reports, I've been involved in 3 or 4 global reports on water that have dealt with water, but they've not really been led by any water agency. So, UNDP, HLP, etc. And we have dominant players and dominant debates that frame the debate. So you have the World Water Council. It's a parastatal NGO. It's very dominated by the big water companies. The GW we've already heard about. The OECD is playing quite a big role in water. They've got this global commission on the economics of water. It's very much at the global level. It's all about new financing, new water economics, very little of the local. And do we really need more of that same stuff, more financing, etc. Water companies have huge convening power, and even more so since the financial crisis of 2008. And they played a big role even in defining global water risks. So you wonder whether they're talking about their risks. Whose risks are they actually talking about? Or are they really interested in the risks and insecurities of very poor, marginalized dwellers? And then there's all these primacy of very global north definitions. And I've already said, there's really a lack of a key champion. Now, Francois went through the papers, and Alan, Francois, and I have had a very interesting email exchanges about some of these anonymous papers. They're quite dull to read, I must say. There's not very much in there. There's this whole idea that different groups are going to make voluntary commitments. So they want voluntary commitments from all the kind of stakeholders. Everybody from an NGO to government will come up with their goals and commitments, which is great. It's very inclusive. But my question is, who's going to take this forward? So many commitments. Who is going to drive the process? There's a lot on the need to value water and financial, financing, but, very little on the cultural aspects of water, the social aspects of water, the multiple ontologies of water, and shit for that matter. So we really don't have that multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary perspective that you need. We've had decades of learning on gender and water, the feminist perspectives, the issues of inclusion, intersectionality, the fact that we're talking about a social crisis of exclusion of people due to their caste, race, gender being excluded from water. Every day this plays out everywhere. And you don't find much of that in these papers. As we've heard from Gauri, how do we integrate water across all the SDGs and development? That's really, really critical. And also the whole issue of climate, how water is at the heart of adaptation and mitigation. But we really haven't got that big impetus around that. So just very quickly, we're really talking about 46 years of forgetting. I've been working on scarcity for a long, long time. And for me, scarcity has very little to do with the physical or the volumetric aspects of water. But most global debates focus on volumetric global amounts and really looking, and that's how global water crises are pitched, rather than looking at questions of access, who has access, who doesn't. Why are we talking in the 21st century of women waiting for 4 hours for water? And this is in Tigray, an area that has also been affected by a terrible war, where, you know, food and water have been used as weapons to really, you know, intensify starvation, poverty, deprivation, hunger, death, sexualized violence, etc. So this is what we really, really need to focus on. So there's no dearth of meetings, ideas, policies, but a lot of these problems and these programs fail to focus on questions of sustainability. You know, you can have a hand pump, but who's going to make sure it works? Questions of O&M and also the interests of poor and marginalized people. So why have we naturalized this level of exclusion? It's because of invisible power, because we really don't take power relations very seriously in this debate. And we have a lot of targets. So I don't really need to go into the history of we first had the MDGs, now we have the SDGs, which are great, huge improvement from the MDGs because they seek universality, equitable access. You had sanitation in there, you have wastewater in there, quality in there. But again, there's a whole issue of accountability. There's diverse interpretations. They're not really integrated with the human rights framework. And there's a lack of attention to power imbalances that have created these crises in the first place. So, you know, we've had a history of almost 50 years of different water decades, of different campaigns. Gauri has already mentioned how most of these campaigns are very top-down, they're state-driven, and you have toilets that are never used, you have hand pumps that are here in the state of disrepair. And I think the critical issue is, you know, how is success measured? Success is not measured around the number of toilets we build or the number of hand pumps we build, but there has to be far more, you know, ensuring quality, ensuring sustainability, looking at questions of inclusion, equity, etc. And also the ability to withstand shocks and stresses, you know, when we're talking about climate disruption. So I guess that's really, you know, taking uncertainty seriously is also something that the water sector needs to do. So my last slide now, I think we need to learn and unlearn and relearn. So I've really, there's so many, these are all very basic things actually. We've been saying the same thing for decades. So I just sometimes wonder whether it's time to pack up our bags and go home. Because, you know, Alan and I, our career started in parallel and I'm sort of saying the same thing. So there's a lot that we can learn from different diverse perspectives. So, you know, the feminist notions of care, of embracing rhythm, on breaking down these unhelpful divisions between domestic and productive. I think Barbara van Koppen is in the audience. She can talk eloquently about that, about bringing together global and local. So don't privilege one over the other. We have to do both together. Also, when we're looking at community-based approaches, look at some of the contradictions within community, look at heterogeneity, look at exclusion. Gauri's already spoken about the need to break down the division between domestic and water management, but there's of course the continued division between water and sanitation, wastewater. We have to bring them all together. And water is also a missing link in food, climate, and energy. So a big passion of mine has been with other colleagues, and we'll be talking about that in New York, is, you know, the very narrow, restricted view of the right to water. Why is it not looking at questions of livelihood? Why is it not encompassing productive uses? Now, we've been talking about doing this too. So, you know, breaking down those silos. I think rights, and there's nothing in this document on accountability. How do we hold powerful actors to account? For pollution questions, for capturing the resource, for appropriation, for grabbing, for privatization, for exclusion. How can you know, and of course, yes, people can go to court. There's a long struggle around realizing rights, but, you know, how do we push that? And when we talk about valuation, we really have to capture different ways of valuing. You know, it's not just the economics of water, and we all know that, but why are these documents just talking about one form of valuing? And as Alan has said, and others have said, you know, the one point that is not up here is also looking at uncertainty and taking uncertainty seriously. We really need to do that to be able to deal with climate disruption. So I would add that point there. And finally, you know, as Alan has already said, well, reclaim the idea of water and sanitation as public and social goods. I think the public character, because when we're talking about social harms due to lack of access, you know, I think that's why we really need to stress that moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another set of provocative ideas and sort of I think about how we learn to unlearn and rewire our thinking to reestablish our narratives in a very different light. So I know the audience has been very patient in waiting for a chance to speak. So first of all, are there any questions, comments that the in-person audience would like to make? I believe there might be a microphone roaming.
That's up to you, really.
Yeah.
Is it, someone's got their hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what we'll do is take two questions from the in-person audience, and then we'll respond, and then we'll go on to the online comments questions. We'll bunch them up, so we'll take 2 or 3 comments that have already been posted in the chat box, and then we'll respond. So we have one in the audience. The gentleman in the red jumper, and then
Hello. First of all, thank you for this really interesting discussion. Yes, my name is Jorge Ortiz, and I'm doing a PhD here at IDS. And my question is related to my research, because I've been researching about the emergence of rainwater harvesting in Mexico City. And this has been a solution, a decentralized solution that now has been inserted into policy. And I have found that this is happening now after many decades in which these kind of solutions have been taken into account with more seriously. So I would like to ask you, these kind of decentralized solutions, you know, off the grid alternatives for populations that don't have access to the network, or the access is unreliable. How you have seen how these alternatives have had a role in the discussion of water over the last 46 years? Thank you.
question. Thank you so much. And then to the lady on the right hand side.
Yeah, thank you for this interesting topic. My name is Ghada. I have mixture between comments and questions. The first thing come to my mind is what's the role of development and aid institution and organization to solve the big issues related to water, and especially we know. So close. I have to make it close. Okay, yeah. Okay. And so I need to know the rules of development and aid institutions and organization, the international ones, in solving the problems of water, especially the global ones, like the ones in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, because it is affecting millions of people's life and food security. And also, I'm always wondering, there is no agencies in UN, specifically dealing with water issues seriously, because the projects in UN, UNDP, UNICEF, and even maybe UNHCR, and even the other international organizations dealing with water problems are very humble projects. They have water department. However, the water department is is dealing with a very projects related to teaching children how to wash their hand and how to distribution soup and building latrines in the camps and providing the people with water through tanks of water. And by the way, they can more making the solving the water problems in more sustainable way. But they didn't do, I don't know why. And also, for example, why they stop when they can make like good water project with a huge budget. They told this is over their limit, however, not because they spending on the soup more than money for, if you accumulated the money on the soup, they will like have big budget. Why the water problem? I don't know. I don't know if I'm young. However, like the problem of water is just emerging now, or because I think it's there is like assumptions or prediction that the third world war will be about water because the scarcity of water, and that affects the food. Thanks, Leila, for saying that we have to learn from, and we keep learning, but I think that we need to move to action now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for those two questions. What I'm going to do is ask our online speakers, Francois or Guri, do you want to take a stab at these two questions regarding decentralized approaches? What is their role within this discussion of providing water and sanitation, and thinking about the role of aid organizations, thinking about the lack of UN engagement in water, thinking about the narratives around water wars? Francois, would you like to take a stab?
Yeah, well, I think the first question clearly is more a question for Guri and Laila, that's for sure. So I don't know if the line, the communication is not very stable. So I don't know if that's on my side or on your side, but so I could not, the second speaker, the second question, I just understood it was about the role of the UN agencies, but then a bit lost what was the focus. I mean, if that is the role of the UN agencies on water governance, which I understood, well, it's I see most of the water problems as quite local, as basin level or aquifer level, or even smaller scales, or at the national level. And I mean, observation of colleagues and friends at FAO, UNDP, working on water and on water governance, shows that the UN institutions always have a problem to deal with the politics of their member states. So they have to be very cautious, and that applies to, I mean, also a lot of international organization, and that prevents them from really playing a role in the governance, because also in the politics, which is basically almost the same thing. So if your observation, if what I gathered was to say that the UN agencies did not do much about governance, I think that's one of the explanation.
All right, thank you for taking a stab. Guri, do you want to take a stab at some of the other questions around decentralized solutions, for example? Oh, I think you need to unmute yourself.
I would like to add to this question a little bit, drawing to the point which Laila mentioned in her presentation, that the UN, they don't have any focused leader agency on water or sanitation, rather. So they're spread between WHO, UNICEF, World Bank, Habitat, but for none of them, water or sanitation is not their principal goal. UNICEF goal is children and their health. WHO is the health. World Bank is the general economic development. So this is a very important issue and weakness for the United Nations for dealing with the issues of the water and sanitation. Now, it all depends on individual leaderships or the interest which the agency takes on a particular time, and then the matter is pushed. Like, International Decade, they all came together to push the water and sanitation side. In the case of the water governance, water management, I still feel, and that is my experience of Southeast Asia and South Asia and others, that even organizations like Global Water Partnerships or EMI is struggling to influence the local the government department or agencies regarding the integrated water management. Now, that it is an institutional fault, and I think the Laila's point is very correct. The time has come, if they really have to save the world, as the previous questionnaire person who put the question said, the crisis of the world from water due to climate change, we need a specific agency of water. Now, how to do it? That I cannot give a solution there. The other side is about the decentralization, about rainwater harvesting and others, which the previous speaker pointed out. My feeling here is that if you give a proper model and accessibility to set up those equipments, the local level, the demand and supply will take care of it instead of have a centralized program. Of course, in certain areas, like in urban areas, and also the large rural areas, population areas, you need some change in the local law for building construction, building designs. But the government has to be proactive, like they're promoting a special dispensation or tax exemption for the cars running with the electricity. There is the green cars. Similarly, the water saving, the facility should be given to the both urban buildings as well as in the rural areas. And I think through that, automatically through the demand supply situation, it should take care of it. There cannot be a centralized program for such things.
Okay, thank you for that. Do the in-person participants want to also say something?
Yeah, I just want to say a few things. There's a lot of really interesting chat going on. I don't know if we're covering it. It's in both the webinar chat and in the question and answers, so it's being kind of dispersed somewhat, but I hope people can follow that. And the role of the UN is coming up quite a lot here, and the nature of the system out there that we're trying to grapple with to deal with a huge global problem, which is, the nature of climate change, the nature of inequality and water and sanitation and water for productive uses. So it's a massive, great problem. It's about as big as they get. And some very important points have been made. It's not a conference with a convention next week. It's a kind of advisory conference. But my response to that, and the question has been raised, should we be asking for a new UN agency? My response to that is, I don't know. I don't know. But I know that the problem is so massive. What do we need, right? So I would push that back to that anonymous attendee. What do we need? We need something. Because, as I showed you, the science is unequivocal. The impacts out there right now are massive, and it's happening as we sit here. So we can't be complacent. We can't sit here and just say, well, okay, we'll wait another 40 years till 2062 and see what it's like then. Because by then, things will have been way past tipping points. So I do think there is a question that needs to be asked about the nature of governance, the nature of this process, the upward accountability issues, and how we tackle that and how we raise these questions in New York. And myself and Laila, I'm pretty sure, will raise these questions in our little small way because they need to be answered right now. I think the process that is there, that has been mentioned, and Fuad, thanks for your comments also in the chat. How does this connect to the other processes at the UN where fresh water isn't mentioned? But oceans are, for example. There's a new oceans treaty, of course. How do we bring this agenda into the minds of big processes out there where it's not being sufficiently tackled? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that there needs to be a continued understanding of the implications of the science for impacts on equality, inequality. The SDGs, as Lila's mentioned, have to be foregrounded. And to go back to the point I think I tried to make, maybe Francois made it better than me, this is politics, right? Ultimately, this is politics. And isn't this surely what the global community is about, prioritizing big issues properly in a global conference and in a global setting? It's about politics. So we need to make this a political issue. It needs to be politicized in the same way that maybe climate change only rose up the agendas because it was politicized. So not to say we need an extinction rebellion for water, but we certainly need something resembling activism and engagement on these water issues that we haven't seen to date. And the sanitized events that we may see next week in New York won't necessarily get us where we need to get. So that's my main point. It's politics, and we need to think about the politics of all of this.
Lila, do you need to add a few comments?
Just very quickly, in terms of decentralized options, in the Brown Gold project, we are actually looking at some of these options, and also, how to turn shit to gold, actually, like, the reuse of shit as a valuable resource, but done safely. And so there's a lot of issues there around technology, institutional aspects, social aspects, acceptability, and then the scaling up question. So with decentralization, you have to really bring all these perspectives, and the same with rainwater harvesting or even with water. So I think, and there's somebody in the Behram in the chat has said something about making water from air. I know very little about that, but maybe that's, I mean, again, there's a technology there, but you need to get everything else right too. It's very interesting because the human right to water was part of a huge battle. It was not endorsed in 1948. Food was there, water wasn't. So you actually have to ask, why is water always so invisible in these global processes? We just take it for granted. It's always taken for granted. And my theory is it's because women are the ones collecting the water and we're just invisible. I mean, they're invisible. So I guess there's something there. We just got used to people. We don't see it as drudgery, and it's all naturalized. So maybe there needs to be a activism, or people have to refuse to get water. Women have to refuse to fetch water for, 3 weeks or something, and then see what happens. I don't know, but, how do we bring it then? Also, somebody in the chat, John Lane, said that it's really important that we can't be talking to ourselves, but, water is so integral for climate, for food, for energy and everything, but people haven't realized that. So how do we make that happen? Whether a UN agency does it or there's other ways to make that happen, that's also something to look out for. But obviously the supranational water bodies like GWP or World Water Council, we've just been talking to ourselves. They've been talking to themselves, I think, largely. But let's hear more from people online. I don't know if somebody wants to speak.
Well, actually, I think Alan and you've done a stellar job of combining both what was in the chat and also in the Q&A, and you've kind of already talked to it. But I see a question in the in-person audience, so I'm going to hand over the microphone to the gentleman in the blue jumper.
Also, we haven't answered Jorge.
I did.
You did?
Thank you all. My name is John Thompson. I'm a fellow here at IDS and an old water hand going back to the water decade when I was working on irrigation supplies and water and wells and so on back then, and have continued to work in and around the sector for a long time. And it's this issue about governance and the sorts of issues you were talking about, because we heard slightly contradictory things when Guri was saying that a lot of those international discussions really haven't translated into action of any meaningful sort. A lot of talk, little action. It's when you bring it down to kind of regional, national scale or basin scale, perhaps, where you start to see some more substantive change taking place, or an opportunity for change. Yet at the same time, we hear about the necessity for raising things to a global level. And we compare the water sector to, say, the climate sector in the IPCC process and so on. And we see now there's the IPBES process around biodiversity. And so we can look at a range of different international processes in complementary or related sectors. I've been thinking about this for a while and wondering, does it make sense we already have a UN Water, which is meant to coordinate across the UN agencies and others in some way, but it doesn't have any kind of mandate in the way that we have with UNFCCC and the IPCC process. But rather than trying to replicate that process, might it make more sense to integrate into those other initiatives the water agenda and elevate it within those discussions and really push hard so that that's brought to the fore? And because we're already talking about those synergies and integrations as well as the trade-offs. So it may make more sense to try to work within those other processes rather than duplicate those processes.
Oh, I saw another hand from this side of the room. No. Okay.
Can I respond to John?
Yes, of course.
So John, I think that is happening slowly but surely. Water Pavilion in Glasgow, Sharm el-Sheikh, there's a incremental movement towards that incorporation in the UN event. Is that incorporation on a kind of, I don't think it's the right term, but equal footing? Is it an incorporation, absorption, and then a kind of desiccation, of those big ideas and the big critical things that need to be examined? Is it a process that will end well? Yes, I mean it's a good thing to do, but does it lead to the dilution? Horrible, punning going on here. But does it lead to the dilution of the big messages that need to go out there? And one that strikes me is the positive feedback loops around water vapor in the atmosphere, helping to increase the warming cycle. So, there are some really, really important science issues out there that need to be brought to the fore. And I don't know if it's going to be brought to the fore sufficiently through that incorporation in UNFCCC, or we need to have some kind of really ramped up global event of some kind around water or global process or global communication mechanism. I don't know what it is, but something that really speaks to these issues and makes sure that they're being tackled politically because they're pushed up the political agenda. But I get your point, and I think it's an important one. And it's also mentioned by someone in the chat, oh God, not another conference. Oh God, not another body. Let's do something about incorporation. It's about the terms of that incorporation. That's the critical thing here. Lila, did you want to?
Let's get some more from the audience if anybody wants to speak.
If they want to, yes, they can, please.
Yes, so perhaps do Guri and Francois want to make any comments to the... Did you want...
Not on that particular point.
Yeah. No, I just want to endorse one point which has been raised on the floor, that by creating a new agency or a big structure, will our problem be solved? The answer is possibly no. And nobody will be in a position to create a new structure. So as Alan and Lila, they're attending this meeting, and if you raise this issue of focal point of water in UN, there is a focal points role by UNDP there, which is the overarching the structure there on behalf of the United Nations. And they had the water group before, and the current UNDP, the administrator, is also a water guy. So I think if you can push for creating of as suggested rightly, a kind of an active group with a clear agenda, with a clear role, then I think with a few 4 or 5 item goal, they will be able to pursue it. I think that will be a more plausible solution instead of asking for a new structure at this stage in the United Nations system. And I think that point is well taken, and I endorse it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Guri. I'm going to open the floor to the online participants. If I know the chat function has been going with lots of ideas and comments, but were there any participants who would like to unmute themselves and ask a question directly? We have, oh, they need to put their hand up. Okay. So would participants who would like to ask a question put their hand up? And then we could call on you. Oh, Ben has got one. Yep. Oh, Baram, would you be
Can you
able?
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, I really enjoyed of pushing for a special agency in the UN centered on water. We may have differences of opinion, but if it's out there on a continuous basis, that could be a legacy which comes out of this conference in New York. It is not a bad idea to ask for that. I think it might help raise the flag of the use of water as a life-giving force. And I wanted to also emphasize the concept of introducing entrepreneurship in this area, where we can bring in the entrepreneurs to bring their creative ideas to address the issue of water scarcity. It cannot be just government by itself. It cannot be civil society. The business has to come in the play. And yes, politics are part of it. That is also included. The more inclusive we get, the better off we'll be in the long run. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those comments, Baram. Any questions, comments from the floor? We're approaching the end of our session, so we'd definitely like to take a final sweep of some thoughts and questions. No? Any online participants who would like to raise their hand, and then we'll be able to call on you? There's one more. Nick Hepworth. I don't see on the screen. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for a really fascinating session. Really, really interesting, timely. I just wonder, in response to what we heard from Francois in particular, is there an opportunity to present an alternative prospectus that collates the banana skins of the past 50 years so that we can avoid them in the next 50 years? And whether there's an opportunity to put up the collective wisdom of those in the room and beyond to use to support and critical reflection on the process and what emerges from UN water. I don't know if we're too late for that. The second quick point to Guri's point about is the power in the room in the UN? I think they certainly will be. The multinationals and banks are piling in on water. The risk is that because of the power dynamics and imbalances, particularly the horrendous lack of inclusion in New York, that turns into a capture of the discourse and some of the outcomes. So there's a hazard there to us. And a final point, as well as a UN agency, perhaps a UN convention. When we pulled together and started to look at how the barriers to referencing good water management in trade agreements, for example, it turns out that one of the bottlenecks is because there is no formal global convention that says what people should do with water. So maybe that's a gap that we could usefully fill and therefore reference as we move forward. So a UN convention on the sustainable, equitable use of water in the economy, for example. But thanks for a great session.
Francois, did you want to make a final comment?
Can I answer her on the first point? Yeah, I think just the question of what are the reasons for not sufficiently taking stocks of what did not work. I think part of the answer is that those who are expected to ask or answer this question are as much part of the problem as of the solution, so to say. So governments in particular are run by a logic of preserving short-term political gains until the next election. So they are incentivized to sweep under the carpet, or at least to minimize problems which have unpopular solution. And as Hank said again, it will hurt. And I think we're forgetting that, if we have a global overdraft of 300 billion cubic meter every year, how do you solve that? You don't solve that without hurting, without severe cuts made in the benefits generated by this volume of water. So who can do that? Who will do that? And these are issues that government prefer to sweep under the carpet many times. UN, I think Marie-Hélène asking whether, why UN is supporting faulty projects. I think, again, they are not much in a position to point to political dimensions of these faulty projects, not to mention corruption. Yeah? So they retreat to technical issues, talk of investments, the same for economic and financial actors. They're just focused on their next quarterly profit performance. And so they have even shorter term logic that are not aligned with the public interest and sustainability. So there's all that needs to be. What went wrong is not something very palatable or something that the main actors want to be discussed. So I think that's part of the reasons.
Yeah, great point. Thanks so much. I think our time is pretty much up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if there are any final comments, questions from the in-person audience. No? If not, I'm going to hand over to Alan, because you had two questions that were posted in the Q&A that you want to ask. So that would be your sort of final wrap-up comment. And then Laila, if there are any further comments that you would like to add on. So Alan.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Naho. Thanks everyone. In fact, your questions and your chat comments have been really very, very insightful and interesting and kind of encouraging as well. And the audience too. I really want to thank you. But Rachel asked a very important question. Rachel Cardoni says, what advice do the panelists have for people on this call who are participating in the conference and side events next week in New York? Well, Rachel, I think my advice is to think critically and ask, is this enough? Is this sufficient? Is this what we need really at this current juncture in time? And to continually have that nagging away at the back of your mind. And if it isn't, then speak out and say, this isn't enough, or this isn't sufficient, or we're not going in the right direction. I think it is a time when we have to speak out and speak our mind. And I think also, John Lane, responding to your point about sort of leadership, I think that's also very important. Charismatic leadership, but leadership that really takes the sector forward and has some impact in the next 5 to 10 years is absolutely essential. And that leadership should come from the global south. I mean, that leadership should come from the parts of the world that are most affected by this. And so generating or building a network of people who can do that and take that leadership on and supporting it is absolutely essential. And I would hope that's something that comes out of New York next week, is maybe a new generation of leaders. Thank you.
Good stuff. Guri, do you want to say some final comments before I hand the microphone over to Laila?
Just want to make one comment that we heard about politicization of water, and also that we need politics to promote water. My experience is that water is already heavily politicized, and the politicians, as rightly said by co-speaker, that politicians, they know how to use it in the short terms in their interest. So the pressure comes on politicians from people. So if we really want to influence the politicians, the message has to go to the people. How to reach the people, that we have to find out. And we found a very good example in case of sanitation, where we could push WASH with the leadership of Nelson Mandela. On one side, we kept a high level of political promotions. The other side, the local level, ground level NGOs did the job. So I think the water community has to decide a strategy of how to pressurize the politicians to do the things in the long run, not in the short run.
Great. Okay, and then Lila.
Thank you. This has been a great session, really exciting comments, wonderful talks from the co-panelists and also from the audience. I think, water is a very fugitive resource. So it's fluid, it's slippery, and it can be grabbed, captured, it's invisible. And I think that's why it's kind of challenging. And also now we have the challenges of climate change and extreme events. So I think that really needs to be embraced rather than a command and control kind of approach, which has been the dominant narrative in the water sector. Politicians are short-term in their approach, and so are bureaucrats, I guess. So not Gauri, no, I wasn't meaning you, but I guess, whichever leaders we have running conferences. So for me, this question of rights and accountability is something we have to push. I know we have Nick and others here, and you're having a session, so that will be useful to see what happens there. We've got to find ways to break this invisibility of WASH and human rights across the board. Obviously it's the silos, but it's also the integration across, but not in a superficial way as you have in the Nexus. So I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. That's something we have to keep pushing. I guess being ambassadors in sectors outside water is what we have to be doing also, not just speaking to ourselves. And in terms of what we need to be doing, yes, we have to ask the basic questions again and again and again, and not give up, because it takes a long time and it's a long struggle in creating water justice and sanitation justice for all. I just want to quickly thank all the speakers. Now, you've been a fantastic chair. Thank you for coming all the way from London. It's very easy to do everything online now. And thanks to Francois and Gauri. That's thanks from Alan and me. We're both co-organizers of this event. Many thanks to our colleagues who helped facilitate this, Ben and Gary. And thanks to the audience here. And let's have a drink now and prepare for next week. Do you want to say anything, Alan, in terms of wrapping up? And great to see everybody online as well as here. Thank you.
Cheers.